So hi, I'm Steve Sheldon, and I'm honored to introduce this next man. And this next man really needs no introduction. From his trademark bandana to his over 40 years in the E Street Band, to being the face of Silvo and Sopranos, you would know this man anywhere. Mr. Stevie Van Zandt, a.k.a. Little Steven, a.k.a. Miami Steve. And who else could say that Little Richard officiated his wedding and the boss, Bruce, was his best man? Stephen is a vinyl lover. Quote, "Vinyl will never be as substantial as it once was, but its comeback is the healthiest thing that's happened to the music industry in over 10 years. Please give a very warm welcome to Stevie Van Zandt.
Thank you.
So we've done this a few times before. Do you have any introductory remarks you'd like to make to these vinyl people?
Well, I started to notice it's about 10 years now or so, maybe 12 years. I started to notice vinyl-only stores popping up in Europe while we were on tour. You know, I'm like, wow. Maybe longer, maybe 15 years. And I was like, man, this is a cool little idea. You know, what a cool trend this is. It's a shame it'll never catch on, you know, because I would really love for that to come back. One of the great mysteries of the world will always be why the record companies and publishers allowed downloading without credits, you know. I'll never understand that, you know. I guess they're trying to fix it now to some extent, but it costs exactly nothing, you know, nothing, right? All you had to do was insist when somebody downloads a record or even streams it for that matter, you know, the credits would go with it, you know. And why is that important? Well, so that the next generation doesn't think that the music falls off trees, you know. You know, it takes a lot of work. You know, it takes a village, as they say, and it's a lot of work, and it's how people make their living. You know, so that was really the number one reason I was glad vinyl was coming back, because for the first time, people actually, you know, humanizes the music. You know, you get a chance to see the credits. You get a chance to see the picture of the band that you can actually see. You know, and you know. It just made it more tactile and more real, you know. So I was glad to see that, and you know, now it's going to be. Somebody has told me, I didn't realize it, that it outsold CDs last year, which is just, you know, great. It's amazing.
What were your first records, and what was that like? That experience of getting them?
I was collecting singles at the time. You know, I wasn't really connected in terms of wanting to do it, but. My first single I bought was Little Anthony and the Imperials' "Tears on My Pillow," a later doo-wop record. But I was buying Palisades Park, you know, Freddie Cannon, Duke of Earl, Gene Chandler, the Four Seasons, Sherry, Big Girls Don't Cry, you know, Walk Like a Man, Dovell's Bristol Stomp and You Can't Sit Down, you know, Curtis Lee, Pretty Little Angel Eyes, in that early 60s period that historians call the fallow period of rock and roll, in between the Legends and the British Invasion. Actually, it was a whole bunch of really cool singles, Dion, you know, in that period. You know, but I didn't really connect with the business in terms of wanting to actually be a part of it until what I call the big bang of rock and roll for my generation. Technically, it was the third big bang, but for me, it was the big one, February 9th, 1964, when the Beatles played a variety show called Ed Sullivan, which was a variety show the whole family would watch on their little TV in the living room. And the most unlikely host ever would have something for the entire family, you know, puppets for the kids and opera for the older folks and something for you teenagers, you know, and something for us teenagers that day was the Beatles. So he had also made history by having the second big bang of rock and roll, which was Elvis Presley on in '56, I think. You know, and so he actually played a big role. I want to get him into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Actually, he deserves to be in. Anyway,
what was interesting too was when the Beatles happened. That was kind of a relaunch for vinyl albums. With Meet the Beatles was a big moment for rock and roll on album.
it literally was the first album almost my entire generation bought. You know, I mean, literally everybody bought that album because they were so big so quickly that the singles just weren't enough. You know, it wasn't enough, and they were the first group to really have no filler exactly. Even the covers they were doing, and they did covers, which is interesting. They did covers until right through their fifth album, right? And the Stones too, as great as writers as they were doing cover songs right through like the first 5 albums. But they were making them their own, and we didn't know the difference, of course, as a kid. You know, you don't know what's a cover and what's original. But they were, that was the first album anybody bought, and they were just so good, just so amazingly good that every song on it sounded like a hit single. And famously, April of '64, they had the top 5 singles on the charts. You know, but. The album started to sell like singles for the first time. I mean, Sinatra had some success, you know, with the first sort of concept albums and had done some good album sales. But mostly it was albums were pretty much best of compilations, you know, for the most part, you know, with Sinatra being, I think, the exception. But this was the first time it was like, okay, now the era of the album has begun. And the era of rock and roll becoming an industry had begun.
So were you a guy who took care of your records, or did you leave them strewn around the house? Or?
I had a little box, which they kind of banged up against each other. And, you know, I actually wore out a couple of singles, which was not easy to do. You had to play it like 900 times or something to wear out a single, I think, before the highs started to go. Isley Brothers' Twist and Shout, I should have mentioned. I actually wore it out. So, you know, it wasn't a whole lot of care, but, you know, we didn't know the difference, you know. And they were really tough. They were made to be tough. They were made to fall on top of each other in a jukebox, you know. It was part of the reason why they were invented. And let me just digress really just for a minute. One of the great stories of rock and roll is the story of the 45 single, and there's a book which you can get called 45 RPM. Jim Dawson and Steve Probst. It's just the most amazing book. If you can get it, you should get it. It's just a small little book, but it's about the birth of the single and how that happened. It's competition between RCA and CBS, and you know, RCA had come up with the 33 RPM for classical music to fit more classical music and jazz onto a 33 rather than a 78 10-inch. And then, so to compete with that, you know, Columbia came up with the 45 single, and because the unions had gone on strike, thinking that the playing of records on the radio would end music. They thought that would be the end of music because it was all live. Radio was all live music up until then. And when they started playing records, it was just a radical sort of transformation. And anyway, they went on strike, and all the big artists couldn't work, and they had to just focus on the edgiest sort of stuff, you know, the country stuff and the teenage market, you know, because they had nothing else for a while. So while they were focusing on the teenage market, which wasn't much of a market yet, they created the 45 RPM player, this small little device which a kid could take into the room, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but it completely changed the world, because up until then, the record player in the house was part of this piece of furniture in the living room, right? With the TV, and this is most houses. You had a TV and a big record player in the same piece of furniture, and you had to ask your parents' permission on what record you wanted to play, you know. So if that little 45 RPM player hadn't been invented, where a kid could take it in his room and then play those little 45s that their mother would never have allowed, you know, you're not going to get Little Richard playing in the living room. That's not going to happen. Elvis Presley or Chuck Berry or Bo Diddley, they were considered, you know, animals. They were like you know, circus freaks. You know, they're going to completely poison our kids, you know, which they did. Thank God. Anyways, it was a little interesting moment there, but it just shows you how sometimes technology can affect history. You know?
Well, there wouldn't have been rock and roll without a 45.
Really? I mean, I'm not kidding. It might have been snuffed out because at that moment it was teetering on the verge of being snuffed out.
You know, you share all this kind of knowledge and perspective, you know, on the Underground Garage and with things you do with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and now with the, you know, Rock and Roll Forever Foundation. At what point in your life and career did you start to feel a charge or a mission to do that, to be kind of a sharing historian and make sure that this knowledge didn't disappear?
I'll tell you the truth, it was done completely for selfish reasons. You know? I am not a nice guy.
Sure you are.
I'm not. I turned the radio on one day. Excuse me, just recovering from a cold and I got allergies on top of that, so forgive my voice today. But I turned the radio on one day. You know, I wasn't paying attention for a number of years, trying to do my thing. I turned the radio on one day and I was like, what happened? Where did music go? You know, what happened here? You know, we grew up, radio was everything. The radio, man, kept you going, kept you alive, you know? And I was like, Jesus Christ, why are we going to be the only generation that, you know, had the greatest music ever made, you know? This shit that's on the radio now is it's like pathetic, you know? And it's going to affect future generations if they don't have access to the real thing, you know? And I just thought to myself, you know, this is not fair. And I think we have an obligation, my generation has an obligation to make the greatest music ever made accessible. You know, of course, it's all my opinion. And you know, so I started the radio show just so I could turn the radio on like the old days and cruise in my car and just have a wonderful experience, you know. And that's why I started the radio show, syndicated. And then Sirius Radio came along a couple of years later, which was wonderful, good timing, because the rest of the industry was dying, and they would be the depository of all the great music. You know, the classic music, the classic format, which most radio stations have now, is a very small, very narrow format. You know, it's fine, nothing wrong with it. It's you know, nice to hear the Doors and Led Zeppelin and wherever they're playing, you know, Boston, whatever it is. You know, that's nice, you know, but that's a very, very, very small percentage of the greatest music ever made, you know. And you know, the normal format, which I think the Underground Garage format should be playing all 60 years of rock and roll, soon to be 70 years of rock and roll. You know, so I just decided to do it on my own, and I did the same thing with country music with my Outlaw Country station. You know, same thing. Just the greatest music being made wasn't available, wasn't accessible, you know. So I decided to put it all on one place, you know, based around the British invasion, but everything that influenced the British invasion and everything the British invasion has influenced pretty much is the center of my universe. And so I include blues, you know, you include R&B and soul and girl group and doo-wop and then everything up through punk and the modern groups. We added up the amount of groups we've introduced to the world over the past 15 years. It was over 1,000 new bands, you know, 1,000 new bands. So that's nice, you know, giving them a format to just express themselves. And, you know, if you make a great record, it's still a place you can get it played, you know. That's how it was done for that reason. But, you know, I think we do have an obligation as a generation to pass on literally the Renaissance, you know. It's like taking away, you know, Michelangelo and Da Vinci and Bach and Beethoven, you know, for the next generation, saying, well, sorry, you know, you weren't alive when it happened, so I'm really sorry about that, you know. But enjoy this new hip hop thing, whatever. It's not a matter of either or. You know what I mean? Everything should be available. And it's a little out of balance now because for good reason. For many reasons. For many years, I was the first one to champion hip hop when it started with the Sun City record. I put they weren't called hip hop yet. It was just called rappers. And when I put them on the record, people were saying, "Why are you doing that? This thing is going to stop. It's just an annoying new trend that's going to go away." I said, "No, it's not. It's extremely important. It's the first time black artists have gotten a chance to express themselves in our entire history. Marvin Gaye had to fight to express himself with what's going on, and Stevie Wonder. Miles Davis was always getting in trouble. Gil Scott-Heron was around.
The Last Poets.
The Last Poets, but they were exceptions to the rule. And here comes these rappers talking about real life. Which at the time was just radical and radically important, I felt, So now, it's gone the other way. It's gone from like, we're going to stop this rap stuff before it starts, to like, oh, wait a minute. It's really cheap and we don't have to market it and it sells millions. We love this hip hop thing. Let's bring it on. So suddenly it went very much to the other extreme. But there's always going to be pop music. There's always going to be, whether it's hip hop or whatever it might be, there's always going to be pop music for kids, which is fine. Nothing wrong with that. But the other stuff needs to coexist with it so that kids have a choice. They have a choice. They're going to grow through pop music as we all did, And then you start looking for a little more substance, and you will find, first of all, the older hip-hop artists, which were a lot more substance, and where the whole genre began was with substance. This is one of the things we teach in the teachrock.org curriculum. You have to go back to where the substance began and realize but that's an age thing. You get to, whatever, 17, 18, 19, you start looking for a little bit more substance. So, then people discover whatever, the Doors or Jefferson Airplane or Led Zeppelin or Bruce Springsteen. They're going to discover them, as they grow up, and that's fine. But make sure it's accessible. Make sure they can discover them, and that was my thing. We got to make sure that this stuff exists, So Sirius came along at the right time, and both channels went on there, and I got the Sinatra channel on there, and others, just to make sure people can get a chance to hear the greatest music ever made, as far as I'm concerned.
As a music lover, did you always have the antenna up, and were you always this accepting of something new and different from, I think back to the mid-'60s when you were listening to British Invasion, were you this accepting of something that was outside of the rock and roll norm?
Well, there wasn't anything at that point. It was very much a monoculture. We were very much a monoculture right up until the early 70s, at which point the whole culture fragmented, But up until then, we were surprisingly very much a monoculture where everybody listened to the same things. Rock music basically did a coup d'etat on the charts and became pop music. It wasn't pop music in the beginning, but it became pop music. And so the greatest music ever made for me is 60s pop music. That's the highest form of our art form to me. It's when craft met art, met pop, The reason why I call it a Renaissance period is because when the greatest music ever being made is also the most commercial, you have yourself a Renaissance period, And that's what was going on, So we were able to grow with the artists as it grew into an art form. It didn't really become an art form until 1965, when the Beatles and Stones and Bob Dylan and the Byrds all started to influence each other and broke through onto the pop charts. And suddenly the whole game changed. It became personal. It started to become more personal. But craft always is the most important thing, and it ruled. It ruled right into the 70s, and then it became a little bit self-indulgent and fragmented and went all over the place.
Well, speaking of craft and considering where we are and what was a big part of that period, what was Motown's impact on you?
In that
Motown.
Well, they would Motown, first of all, had been making the greatest, among the most important Renaissance labels. For me, if I had to name the greatest album ever made, period, it would be The Temptations' Greatest Hits, for me, where performance meets composition, meets arrangement, production, it's all there, So they were at the forefront of, it was ironic because Berry Gordy set out to try and make, black music acceptable to white kids. He ended up making the greatest black music ever made, that defined black music and black identity in a wonderful way. It was just ironic. And he actually brought the audience to him rather than going to the audience, The audience was loving David Ruffin's soulfulness just as much as Diana Ross's sweetness. He was hoping the sweetness would sell it, But he didn't need to do that, They were all, fantastic. So anyway, so Motown was having all these amazing hits with all these amazing artists, and then in the 70s, the Norman Whitfield took over the production and started to get into the psychedelic stuff, which was great, and then the political stuff with what's going on, and so it was, I wouldn't say leading. I'm not sure if they were ahead of Curtis Mayfield, for instance. Curtis Mayfield was probably there, and like I said before, Gil Scott-Heron was there, Last Poets were there, but they were starting to, they were always reflecting what was going on in the culture, and in fact, popularizing what was going on in the culture. So they were very important, right into the 70s.
As you became a record maker, with the Jukes and then with Bruce and any of the things before that. In the studio, what are you thinking about in terms of what will make a record sound good? So after that initial performance is captured and recorded, what's that?
This was the thing. I began producing right at the perfect wrong time, right? Because that was the point where technology started to work against you. Every record in the 50s and 60s basically sound great. If you had to compare. Suddenly, the 70s comes, we finally make it into the studio, and I start producing almost right away, and everything sucked. Everything sounded terrible in the 70s, from my ears. And so I had to analyze it. Why? What's going on? What kind of bad luck is this, Is it just us? No, it wasn't just us. Everything sucked, Why? Because of a couple of things. The engineers started to take over rather than producers, and they started to close mic everything. The clarity became this priority, and they started to close mic everything and pad all the walls, and suddenly everything was all. Most important thing was to have separation, and then, we'll make it exciting when we mix it, which was just stupid, And that's what everybody was doing, So I had to study. I'm studying like, oh my God, this is an opportunity. We have an opportunity to, and we had been struggling between Bruce's records. I'm kind of experimenting with the Jukes at this point. The first 3 Jukes albums I produced were all produced very, very differently because I'm trying to figure it out. And we go through Bruce's 4th album, Darkness. And it's just torture, It's just torture. It just sounds terrible every day, And so I'm like, so he asked me to co-produce the 5th album, The River, and I'm like, I got to figure this out, I can't go through this again. This is not the way to make a living. This is not the way to live. It should be a pleasure. It should be fun, And so I figured, I studied what was going on. And what was going on was basically, in the 50s and 60s, you had room mics. You had mics placed around the room, and you had the room sound. You had the atmosphere of the room. It sounded alive, and also the drummers had. All the drummers of the 50s and 60s had studied with jazz guys, which meant 2 things. They played with their wrist up, and they played easier, and they knew how to tune their drums. This was pretty much gone by the 70s. You know, people had started banging on the drums as hard as they could. What they didn't understand was the harder you hit a snare drum, the smaller it sounds. You know, so you know, just figured all this stuff out. We found the right studio. We found the right engineer, a guy named Bob Clearmountain, who I've been working with ever since. He mixes my records to this day, and we used the overhead room mic because it was a high ceiling, which was unusual in a studio at that point. You didn't have those big rooms anymore, but it had a high ceiling, so we used a high mic, and I just turned up that room mic, you know, and that's the sound of those drums on Hungry Heart. Right? When those drums come in on Hungry Heart, that's that sound, right? That's the sound of the room, you know, and that was the first thing I produced, and so we were able to figure out, you know, the basic methodology of recording, which was, you know, a return to the 50s and 60s, basically, you know, with a little bit more, you know, more tracks, obviously. You know, you weren't doing 2-track or 4-track or 8-track anymore. You were, you know, doing 24 or even 48 tracks. But it was still, it was exciting. It sounded like, you know, it sounded like a record right away. You know, I mean, you'd have to wait till he mixed it to put the excitement in, which is just, you know, this insipid, moronic way of working, you know. You know, I'm just big on the journey. You know what I mean? I'm like, the destination is whatever, man. I want to dig the journey. You know, I want to dig life every day. You know, and enjoy it and feel I'm doing something of quality every single day. You know.
So conversely, working now, you know, recording Soulfire and whatever else you do, are there things in today's technology that are helping you make them sound the way you want to and make them sound good for vinyl as well as digitally?
Well, I'm ashamed to say it's difficult to go all the way analog, you know. I don't know how we did it, to be honest. Okay.
You didn't have any other choice.
That was it. I have tried. I'm like, I'm going all the way analog. I'm going to keep this record at 24 tracks, which doesn't sound like it would be that difficult, but it is. So, you know, I kind of compromise. I record on tape still, you know, which most people don't. But it sounds different to me. It sounds different when you record.